We the people. Now, you might ask, so what does this historic backdrop mean for the Second Amendment and for the right to bear arms? I would argue it means everything. Notice they said these rights are unalienable. Now, when you get to the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment begins in a very interesting way. It talks about the inherent right to bear arms. It doesn't say the Constitution gives you the right. It says the right to bear arms will not be abridged, which implies that the Founding Fathers who wrote the Constitution believed that your right to bear arms came from your Creator and was unalienable. It did not come from the government. Now, you might say, why did they think this? And I want to recommend to you, it's a fascinating story in history. If you go back and you look at 236 years ago this month, the British Army set out from Boston to crush the rebellion. Tension had been building for a number of years, and the Americans were being very uppity, and the British Empire was the richest, most powerful empire in the world. And David Hackett Fisher wrote a tremendous book called Paul Revere's Ride, in which Fisher's a great historian, and he describes the setting that led to Paul Revere's Ride and what happened after he rode out to warn the colonists. And he points out in his book that the British Army knew how to crush peasant rebellions. They'd crushed rebellions in Ireland, they'd crushed rebellions in Scotland, they'd crushed rebellions in Wales, they'd crushed rebellions in rural England. And so the professional soldiers who were marching out that day, they knew what they were doing. They were going to encounter a bunch of rabble, they were going to scatter them, they were going to seize their weapons, they were going to imprison their leaders, and it would all be over. And then they ran into this problem. They didn't have any peasants to fight, and they didn't have any rabble to fight. They had freestanding Americans who had been training as a militia and who were prepared to fight the British Army toe to toe. And by the end of the day, the British Army was running back to Boston, suffering substantial casualties, and in a state of shock. Now, the Founding Fathers knew this history. They had lived this history. And they knew that if they had not had the right to bear arms, they would have been crushed that day. They then engaged, they issue a Declaration of Independence. And on July 9th, 1776, General George Washington, on Bowling Green in Manhattan, has it read to the Continental Army. And that Declaration of Independence defies the most powerful empire in the world and asserts the rights I just described to you. Now, this is an army that is going to get beaten very badly. It gets beaten in September in Brooklyn. It gets beaten in Manhattan. It gets beaten at White Plains. It gets beaten at the Palisades. It gets driven across New Jersey. By December of 1776, 5 months after the Declaration is announced, all these happy-go-lucky people who thought it was going to be easy were gone. And they were down, they shrank from 30,000 to 2,500 men. Those 2,500 men were on the edge of collapse. And Washington proposed the most daring possible strategy. He said, why don't we cross the river in the ice during a snowstorm at night, march 9 miles, surprise a professional German unit, defeat them decisively, and reestablish the morale of the revolution. Every single one of his generals said to him, this is too hard. We can't do this. And Washington, who had been fighting as early as 18 or 19 years of age and was very seasoned and had been through some very dangerous moments, had once had two horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes in his coat during the French and Indian Wars in one day. Washington said to them, well, you know, if we don't win someplace, this army is going to desert. When the army deserts in another week or two, we will have lost the war. When we lose the war, everybody in this room is going to be hung. So we have nothing to lose. It's a little bit like the New Hampshire slogan, live free or die. I always remind people it's not live free or whimper, live free or hire a lobbyist. So that night, they crossed the river. Now, Washington was a very, very shrewd person. He knew that people are moved as much by words as they are by deeds. And so he had recruited Thomas Paine, who had written a great pamphlet, Common Sense, which was the best explanation of the Declaration of Independence and which had been very widely read in the colonies. And he recruited Paine, and Paine wrote a pamphlet called The Crisis, which begins, "These are the times that try men's souls." And in fact, last year, Bill Fortune and I wrote a novel called To Try Men's Souls, which is about this crossing. So as the troops are getting on the ship that night, and they're going over in rowboats, Washington has the officers reading the opening chapter that talks about summer soldiers will have deserted, but that if you stand firm, all eternity will owe you gratitude for having stood up for freedom. So here's this hardy band of 2,500. 1/3 of them do not have boots. They're marching with their feet wrapped in burlap in the ice and snow and leaving a trail of blood. They cross the river at night. They then discover, to their surprise, they have to cross 2 ravines. We have to take the cannon down one side, up the other side, in the ice during a snowstorm, and they're running 4 hours late, 4 hours late. If you war game this, you play it out as a board game at home, the Americans get annihilated because they arrive after dawn and the professional German soldiers kill them. However, there was one other factor. They're being pushed forward by an enormous wind coming out of the north with an enormous snowstorm. And so they're marching south. And the professional German soldiers conclude that no European army could be out in this kind of weather. And so they don't post their guards. And it's not that they're sloppy, it's not that they're stupid. They made a totally reasonable calculation if they were fighting Europeans. Now, they forgot that in America, many of you who are deer hunters will understand this, Americans often go hunting in the weirdest possible weather. So for all these American soldiers, this was kind of like normal. It was cold, it was miserable, but it was normal. They surprise the Germans. At the cost of 1 American, they capture 800 professional soldiers. They run like crazy for the river to get across again before the British Army can catch them. They've won a great victory. Within 2 weeks, 15,000 volunteers show up. Washington takes the new forces, drives the British out of northern New Jersey, and the Revolutionary War has been saved. Now, it doesn't end. Washington is in the field. I want you to remember this when you're campaigning next year and you get tired and you start saying, oh, gee, this is too hard. Washington was in the field for 8 years. He spent 1 week at Mount Vernon in 8 years. That was the price of the freedom you have. That night, because they really were down to the end, the password that night was victory or death, and they meant it. Now, these are the people who wrote in the right to bear arms. And I just want to say, and I don't want to offend anybody here who's a hunter, the right to bear arms is not about hunting. It's not about target practice. The right to bear arms is a political right designed to safeguard freedom so that no government can take away from you the rights which God has given you. And it was written by people who had spent their lifetime fighting the greatest empire in the world, and they knew that if they had not had the right to bear arms, they would have been enslaved, and they did not want us to be enslaved, and that is why they guaranteed us the right to protect ourselves. It is a political right of the deepest importance to the survival of freedom in America.